And so for a long time, I wound up using Ubuntu for stuff where nothing else worked because that was what worked. I always tried to use it as an opportunity to learn to see if I can fix my thing too. And that's kind of how we got started doing all these things in multiple distributions. Eventually, one of the things that I came to figure out was that if I wanted to do something well, if I wanted to do something right, I have to provide the maximally useful, minimal viable solution. And the way that works is I have to think about the different distributions that I use and work with and interface with. And I think about the solutions I'm making and see what the requirements of all the different ones are before I make something. And then I go make something and put it in all of them. Because if I don't do it that way, what winds up happening is you create these little islands of inconsistency, and you create these different, you get these different ways of solving the problem in different thought processes, not necessarily in a way that multiple, like the whole community can benefit, but only some communities can benefit. And so, like for example, Fedora's multimedia stuff. That's actually I took a good chunk of what I did in Fedora from OpenSUSE. And then the improvements I did in Fedora I ported back to OpenSUSE. Right. And so, like, for me, it's not about making just one platform better or the other. It's about making the whole community benefit from all the stuff. And so whenever I try to make something, like, I'm not going to go out super crazy and go do it for everybody. Like, there's just too much Linux for that.
Sure, there's only so much time in the day.
Yeah. But I will try to at least have more than one. That so I try to make things that work for Fedora and OpenSUSE at least, and see if I can extend it further, or at least I'll talk to other people and say, like, hey, this is something I did across more than one distribution. Do you think this could help for you and whatever? And as it turns out, when you build something that's in more than one distribution already, if it's in 2, it's easier to get it to 3, to then 4, to then 8, to then all of them.
Right.
So you can accelerate that snowball effect and that network effect. An example of this was, I think it was like almost 6 years ago or something like that. I made the change in Fedora from the old package config implementation. So the package config is a tool that you use in development to be able to find out compiler flags for using a library or a module or something for building a project. We use this all the time all over the place in Linux land. There are multiple implementations of package config. So the one that Fedora was using was some old version that was originally made by Debian, and then part of GNOME, and then part of Free Desktop. It's all over the place. Wasn't super actively maintained. Kind of a pain to work with and customize. And at the time, I was looking at, like, how can I make it easier for me to support more features and more capabilities, and also to be able to bootstrap into new architectures and platforms? Package config had a recursive bootstrap problem, which was not great. And so taking that out was important. Well, there was this implementation, another implementation of package config called PackageConf, PKGCONF. And I met the developer of it.
So that was from 2017-ish? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, I found the wiki page.
Yep. And the maintainer, who now is Ariadne, the lead of Alpine.
Oh, yep.
So she created, back then she hadn't transitioned and I knew her by a different name, but that's not important. But like, so if you find references to an old name in there, it's because, well, I'm trying not to dead name, but if you look up the history and go through it,
sure. If
you will be confused
from 6 years ago, yeah.
But Ariadne, who created Alpine and APK, and also created PackageConf, and so I worked with her to, like, address any things that I felt that we needed for Fedora, and then we swapped the implementation. Then I introduced it in OpenSUSE, and I got them to swap the implementation. And then I did it in Mageia, and I got them to swap the implementation. And after 3, essentially all the major distributions had swapped. And we'd gotten to a point now that people were just on their own switching. So then OpenMandriva did it, and then Debian finally, I think it was like a couple of years ago, they finally pulled the trigger on it. There was a whole There's a whole other set of background reasons for why it took so long for Debian. Not going to get into it, but they did it finally, and so package.conf has essentially replaced package config. It's also started replacing it in BSDs too, because it's not. I'm a copyleft guy. Ariadne is not so much. So she wrote it and licensed it in a permissive license. BSD people like permissive licenses, so it was an easy win for them. So that's kind of like, that was my first real experience doing that. I was like, oh, this works. And so I just started doing it for everything. And like the Btrfs stuff that we did that I've done in Fedora with a bunch of other people, like several years later in 2020 for Fedora, was very much inspired by not only the experiences I had during my day job at the time from dealing with ZFS and Btrfs, but also from using OpenSUSE, doing my own experiments working with Btrfs, and coming up with the right way to adopt it, and building on that to put it in. Obviously, the implementation of Btrfs in Fedora is different from OpenSUSE because there's a number of things that I left out on purpose. Things like the automatic snapshotting and whatever, because figuring out the schemes for doing that is highly distro specific. And so like the SUSE implementation of this doesn't work on Fedora, not completely. So there's adaptations and other stuff you have to deal with. But it's always been a goal to be able to get to a point where we can have full system snapshotting and stuff like that. But you have to start somewhere. And so that was the starting somewhere. And again, every solution I've worked on so far has been like, let's try to reduce the differences. Let's try to improve things. I introduced DNF as an alternative package manager in Magia in like 2015, 2016. And I also introduced it in OpenSUSE, I think, a few years after that.